So we're going back on stage again. We're going to be live in the Cork Opera House on March 30th for a very special event, which is going to form part of the Cork Podcast Festival. Our show is called Look Who's Talking. It's going to be all about those criminals. How do we get them into studio? How do we get up close and personal with them? And what have they got to say when the cameras are off? So Cork Opera House, tickets from corkpodcastfestival.ie, 30th of March. See you there.
You should have gone for the bobbin in your...
What?
Are you recording? You should have gone
hair.
for the bobbin in the hair now.
I lost my bobbin
Yeah.
down in the garage in the basement, and I knew I lost it, and I looked around the ground for it, and then I looked as if I was scrabbling for 20 cents or something. So I had to give it up. And I've no bobbin, and then I'm after trying to put the pen in.
Symptomatic of the level of preparation that goes into
the level of preparation, and we're having a big discussion about how exhausted we are.
Yes.
We're near burnout. So yeah. Nobody cares or wants to hear about that.
No.
People just want more podcasts.
Yes. And more bobbins.
We're gonna do a Q&A because it's nice to allow the listeners and the viewers ask the questions.
Yeah.
And the more the merrier. So keep those questions coming in. And every chance we have, we'll get in and we'll dip into a few of them and we'll talk around them. So keep them coming in to the email address.
Yes. Which is?
crimeworld@sundayworld.com.
That is correct.
At last.
Well done.
At last.
So, Love Hate was back in the news, obviously, because of John Connors. It was a fantastic story. John Connors declared Love Hate back. Then it turned out it wasn't back. And then he declared that he hadn't declared it was back. He merely declared it was a spin-off show or something along those lines. Not to get into the whole controversy, fair play to John Connors.
He was in or something.
It was about his character. But it was amazing because all of a sudden people, like, I don't know if you saw that on social media, they were starting again, watching Love Hate. I saw loads of people saying, I'm back at this and I'm back at this series. Like, how long ago was it? It's over nearly a decade now, at least, since it's finished. And it's still the number one, really, isn't it? That
I'll tell
show.
you now, I went back over it late last year.
Well, the question is...
And somebody else in the household is going back over it now who doesn't even like crime.
No.
So it's amazing, the popularity of it. Go on.
So the question is Love Hate based a lot on what happened in real life? So, I mean, I think certainly the first series of Love Hate took very directly a lot of incidents that occurred in real life. It was, that show evolved as it went on. And I think it was in two stages. The first stage, it even opens up with the Darren's brother is shot. He comes out of prison. And it was very like the hit that, of course, Joey O'Callaghan gave information about when
Jonathan O'Reilly was
Jonathan O'Reilly was Clover Hill.
Yeah.
So then you had a number of other incidents that were really, really heavily based
and actually, funny enough, before you go on from that, there was another hit that was very similar to it that I was writing about recently. We've always said the Jonathan O'Reilly case was similar. Jonathan O'Reilly was actually killed outside the prison, but I don't think he had just been released from the prison. I think he was in a car.
Yeah.
And Thomas Hinchin, obviously, and Brian Kenny killed him.
Yeah.
They knew he was going to be. Was he collecting somebody from the prison or
something
whatever?
like that, yeah.
But something even more similar to that scene in Love Hate you're talking about was when Mark Byrne, a 31-year-old back in May 2005, and he was granted this temporary release on compassionate grounds. Now, he had been in prison at that time with a very young Robbie Lawler.
Yep.
And they'd fallen out. Now, Robbie Lawler was younger than him, but had sort of, stood up to him. And, Byrne had this kind of pedigree as a criminal, but Lawler was showing, what he might become because he'd no fear of him. And they'd fought in jail and probably Byrne got the better of Lawler. Lawler had been released. So anyway, Lawler kept in touch with some of the contacts he had within the prison system, and he heard that Byrne was due out on temporary release. So he was in Mountjoy training unit, wasn't he? And he had been previously in Portlaoise, I think, where he'd been friendly with Gilligan.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, they had been in Wheatfield prison where this clash between them happened. But Lawler, who was only 20 at the time, heard that he was due out because he had a big issue actually blew up in the aftermath about it, smuggled mobile phones, and the prisons bought, because they realised that what he did had been organised from prison. And the prisons actually ordered this equipment that could go down and around the toilets because they used to hide the phones there. But anyway, it was May the 4th, 2005, and 10 a.m. The door of that Mountjoy training unit, which we've sat outside many a times, opened, and Byrne walked out. And he went sort of down the road to a newsagent at the junction of Vincent Street and Berkeley Road, and he went in to buy credit.
Yeah, mobile phone credit, yeah.
Okay. And as he came out, he was approached from behind and he was shot at point blank range. Now, you're talking at 10 a.m. in the morning. There's commuters going by, there's shoppers going by, and they witnessed the whole thing. And they later actually tell Gardaí, and this is again a measure of what sort of a ruthless killer that Lawler will become, that he shot him and then he stood over the top of him waiting to see was he alive or dead, and put one more bullet into him before he just strolled off.
Yeah. And look, that was the beginning of a long series of killings, really, wasn't it?
It was. And you know, you talk about love-hate, and you know, that's the beginning of it. And obviously what happens there then has
the
effects, ripple effects. And the same happened really in the real life.
The real life
of Robbie Lawler and all that went on.
I mean, the other one, of course, that was...
But I'm practically just describing that scene there, aren't I?
You practically are. I mean, there's some of them, obviously the makers of Love Hate always were sort of, didn't like that real life comparison, you know, and there was always differences. But the case of Hughie, John Boy's brother, I mean, that was almost a direct copy of what happened to Philip Colopy. If you remember Hughie, he was kind of the out of control brother of John Boy, played by one of the Gleasons. His name escapes me, but he there's a scene where he kills himself accidentally. He's showing off with a gun. He's showing how he could hold it to his head, and he pulls the trigger. Like often I think they say with guns that one gun can be lodged in the barrel basically, and it's not in not that I know much about guns, but it's not visible.
Yeah,
and this is sort of a direct, almost the exact same as what happened to Philip. He pulls the trigger and kills himself accidentally, just showing off. And that, of course, did happen to Philip Colopy at a party in Limerick. Philip Colopy was one of the Colopy brothers, probably the most feared member of the Keane Colopy gang. He was regarded as the number one enforcer for that outfit that fought that long feud with the McCarthy Dundons. He was the prime target for John Dundon. And he was some of the Colopy brothers were more involved in other aspects of the business, but Philip Colopy was regarded as the most dangerous. But he was in a party in Limerick, was showing off his handgun, group of people sitting in a room. He was waving it around, showing how he could shoot somebody, and I forgot there was a bullet in the handgun and shot himself in the head. Like, you know, so that was certainly too similar to be not.
Two scenes out of many that you could relate to real life. I think the thing about Love Hate was, and it's revived. I think it's because it's gone on one of the UK channels.
It is, but
and all of a sudden a UK audience has discovered it, and it is really, really good.
Yeah, I mean,
I think that's sort of the things that in Love Hate that, you know, from a wider point of view, very interesting look at the women's role in gangland, you know, because, and I suppose the fact that these very violent individuals who are making money out of drug trafficking and, you know, fighting one another and all the rest of it, can also be family men. And they have this, Nidge in particular, because he has a certain amount of patience for it all, doesn't he?
He does, and a certain amount of, being almost browbeaten by the missus, despite having affairs and all of the rest of the stuff. So I think that is, when he loves his kids, as a lot of criminals do, so it's a funny...
Sort of, I suppose, he's so narcissistic in a way, Nidge, isn't he? That the child is nearly seen as sort of the extension of himself, and he does put up with Trish and her nagging, but at the same time, she grates on him as well.
She does.
Even though they're going to be together. And she puts up with a lot to be with him. And I think that's very much the reality in many ways for women, you know, in relationships with gang members, that the men sort of tend to be very alpha male. You know, a lot of them can be, you know.
Well, look, I mean, I always think about the men involved in gangland crime. I mean, the level of domestic violence in some of them relationships is quite shocking. It's so much more common. And while these guys can love their kids and even love their wives maybe, but there's such a lot of violence, because it's very hard to be violent on the street and then imagine somebody can go home and just be a totally loving guy. And of course, Darren starts off like that. He's very sensitive with in the first series with his love interest. He's very Ruth, was that her name? Ruth Negga is the actress. Yeah. He's very but like that's kind of an unrealistic picture actually of a gangland criminal, because you know, you can't really have those two sides at that extreme. They tend to bleed into each other. I think Nidge is a more realistic portrayal. While he might love his family and even love his wife, you know, the lying and the violence and all of that stuff is a part of it.
And the pressure that comes on him and how that pressure is acted out. And the other thing I thought was interesting as well is to tackle the idea of somebody getting, you know, beaten or shot or whatever and ending up injured. And in the case of Tommy, who ends up sort of brain damaged, you know, and all that goes with that, and the relationship that he has left, you know, how does she stay with him when he's like that? I mean, it is so close to real life in many ways, and a lot of the scenes are very close to things that we can pull out of our head and out of our sort of reporting careers, that we can say that's very similar. But I think in general, it was so popular, and it remains popular after all these years. I mean, it was 2010, I think, that it was launched. So, you know, here we are 15 years later, and it's still getting new viewers.
Because it's still great. I mean, that is the reality. And, you know, some of the programs, you know, they age so badly, but this hasn't. And you can see as it goes on, they've obviously, I think by the time when they're planning the Tiger kidnapping bank raid, I can't remember, I think it's the second last season. Like you can tell, in my opinion, that they have spoken to somebody who may have been a retired guard or something, but they have got, like that is like, it's very like that Eamon Dawn scene, but you can tell that they have been given a really good briefing in how that gang is operating and that robbery, and also the sort of paranoia. I thought that was... They've progressed as well into a level of realism that's shocking, shockingly accurate, I would imagine, you know.
Good writing, of course, and good directing, and, you know, hard to believe that was an RTE drama series, because, I mean, there's been nothing like it done.
No, obviously Kin is a different type of programme. I enjoyed it as well, thought it was good, but...
Kin is Bron. You know, it wasn't made by
No,
RTE.
it wasn't made by RTE. But I mean, like Love Hate was, and you can see the value of RTE making these things, because they're still selling it and it's still doing good.
They've never done anything like it since.
They haven't, no.
And it was a kind of a brave time in there, I think, when they decided to do that, because nobody had done anything like it before. It's so hard to imagine RTE pumping funding now into a drama around gangland, and yet still, you know, it is a popular genre.
It is a popular genre.
Now,
thank God.
Okay, thank God. Yeah, keeps us in jobs. I wanted to just go to this one next, because of course John Gilligan is back in the news, because he's just so goosed. He's in prison. He's been caught with all these drugs. The last time we talked about him, we were discussing how the Spanish police had released some notebooks that he had kept notes about his drug supplies and who owed him what and how he had planned to collect some money and this, that and the other. And the question here from a listener is, does John Gilligan have family? And the reason I think that's interesting is because John Gilligan had a family, a very close-knit family who stood by him loyally for years, but you'd wonder where they are now, because they're not visible any longer. The last member of his family who certainly seemed to be at his side was his son, Darren Gilligan, who was he was caught up in the previous drug bust, where Gilligan had been found to be sending pills and cannabis back in the post to the UK and Ireland, where he was brought before the courts with other members of what were seen as that operation, including Fat Tony Armstrong. And Darren Gilligan was one of those who appeared at the court at that stage. And that is the last we see. Now, I understand Darren Gilligan is back in Ireland and they are no longer as tight and close as they used to be. Now, father and son were nearly always together. I mean, even in Ireland, when Gilligan was clinging to the end of the years that they were in Jessbrook, in the house beside the equestrian centre, he had a son with him when he was trying to keep the gardens himself because he probably hadn't the money to pay somebody else to do it. John and his wife Geraldine, who were sort of teenage sweethearts, met in Ballyfermot, where they were both from, and would have this famous piece of video that was taken from some sort of a, holiday thing.
Yeah.
I think they're in Sandy Lane on a holiday and they're very much in love, the two of them. It's the heyday of the Gilligan gang. They're socialising with other members of the gang, with Brian Meehan, with Paul Ward, with John Traynor, various people like that. They all went on holiday together. They went to the races together. They enjoyed themselves. Gilligan was always a ladies' man. He always had an eye for somebody else. And indeed, when he was found to be in the UK or in Amsterdam at the time Veronica Guerin was killed, he was with his then young lover, Carol Rooney, who was ultimately, I think she ended up going far-flung and into witness protection.
Different part of the world.
But she was with him when the calls came in that Veronica Guerin had been killed. But there was Geraldine, and of course they had two children. They had Tracy Gilligan and they had Darren Gilligan. And daughter Tracy, again, was with her father and loyal to him before and after his stint in prison here on for a drug conviction. She was certainly out in Spain after he was jailed here. She ran the Judge's Chambers pub. She had been in a relationship with his friend, Liam Judge, the pub was in his name, but it was long believed to be Gilligan's. Liam Judge died. She took over when we tried to purchase the pub some years ago in an undercover sting. She was the one who appeared to sell it. And then they don't seem to be together. And like many families, of course, Gilligan had many sort of affairs and all the rest of it along the way. But in more recent years, he is completely split from Geraldine and has a new relationship with an English woman called Sharon Oliver. And whether that's been the complete kibosh on the relationship with himself and his immediate family, I don't know. But the answer to that is family, yes, he does. They don't seem to be too close to him these days. I know his brother and himself, Thomas Gilligan, are still in communication. Thomas Gilligan lives in Dublin, and it was in his house where John Gilligan was shot. But family seems to be this sort of group of old codgers in Alicante that he rattles around with, and other sort of, somewhat known types from Dublin who go out there and he drinks with. And he's a bit of a sort of a sad character clinging to his youth these days.
I mean, I always thought with Tracy and his son Darren that, there's some guys that are involved in criminality that go to extreme lengths to make sure that it's kept really distant from their kids and that they're not sucked into that life.
Yeah.
And the examples of those are numerous, where they really put a firewall up between them. I always felt sorry for the two Gilligan kids. I thought they were kind of sucked into things only on the edges of it. And Geraldine as well. And of course, in the documentary that John Gilligan made, there was a lot of talk, and he was questioned about the level of domestic violence that occurred. Geraldine Gilligan certainly stuck by him through a lot, but she was put through a lot of extreme violence, and those kids grew up obviously in that sort of toxic atmosphere. Geraldine Gilligan was a sort of interesting character in her own right, and there was always a belief that they hadn't split up initially, but it clearly she's separated from him, and it must have been
It must be hard not to when somebody's in prison for a lengthy period of time. I mean, like, we're not going to go too deep and meaningful into whether, love exists or whatever, but maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, so John Gilligan, so they had their 2 children. They were at a point in their marriage, I suppose, that the kids were grown up when he sort of makes it big, makes loads of money. And they have this couple of years where they're this, like, they are absolutely surrounded by wealth. They're the Lord and Lady of the Manor at Jessbrook. They have the equestrian centre. People are coming to events there, and they're about to kind of break into really high society, aren't they?
Yeah.
And then he gets caught because he's obviously assaulted Veronica Guerin while he was never convicted of her murder. A member of his gang have been convicted of his murder, and it's long been said that his gang carried out that assassination of her. And everything goes to shit then after it, because he obviously doesn't, nobody considers, shall we say, the reaction of the state to that. And the reaction, of course, was to go after him and all his gang members, to bring them back before the Special Criminal Court. First time it was used outside terrorism and paramilitary suspects. And they get really big sentences. He goes to jail for, what did he get? 20 years plus
something
for
like
cannabis
that.
stealing.
Yeah. I mean, it was
It's unheard of these days.
Yeah, a huge sentence. And what happens then is he goes into prison into Portlaoise. For a while, he has the aura around him. He's the top dog. He's, meant to be pulling strings on the outside. But relatively quickly, he sinks down the food chain in Portlaoise. Younger criminals with networks outside start to push him around to an extent. Now, he's always, fought back against that. But, during his time in prison, he went from being, the most feared criminal to just being, almost a joke within that prison system. And he didn't have that broad network. So he did need his family, I suppose, at those times. And but I mean,
he's facing a very lengthy prison sentence now at the moment, and we try to follow this as much as we can. It's difficult enough in Spain, but one way or another, he's likely to face trial. If he gets bail before that, he gets bail, but that doesn't really look like it's happening. And if he does get a lengthy prison term, he's more than likely going to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Where he will really need family. And the question is something toxic happen there that...
Well, I think that, he has spoken himself about that level of domestic violence. And what happens, of course, in a lot of these cases with women that are in those relationships, things that seem normal at some point, as the separation occurs, the abnormal no longer seems normal. And, there was a lot of people who always felt Geraldine Gilligan would never get away from him, but good luck to her, and that she has,
Now, here's a question for you, because I've answered this a number of times, and I'm sure people are bored listening to me about it, but this is interesting for you because yours is a far more interesting answer on this. Anyway,
Okay.
So a listener says, not crime related, but I'd love to hear your career path progression. I always wanted to be a journalist, but I ended up in insurance.
Yes. I have a different career path than you do, because even we were talking at lunch there, and you were saying were you in the press at 15 or you were obviously doing just
work
experience.
Yeah.
So you knew there
was
something you looked at and thought, that's what I want to do.
I think it was Superman.
Was it? Which Lois Lane?
Yeah. It has to be. That's the only thing that fits my timeline, because I've no idea why I wanted to be a journalist.
Because
as long as I knew or was asked that question, what do you want to be, I would have said a journalist. So it has to have come from somewhere. There was none in my family.
Yeah, and you will see a lot of people in journalism. They have family in it, and they come in just like any career. So I got my first job in journalism when I was 30 years old.
That's so mental.
And
30?
So I'm actually 49. If people are looking at this and thinking he must be I thought he was only 32.
Yeah. Which of course, despite
many people, this might be a shock to other people.
When you're in black, you see.
So, and I'm trying to think about what I wanted to be when I was 15. I think I wanted to be, I thought
Don't say an astronaut.
No. I thought I can never imagine having a job.
Right.
Having a job seems like the worst thing you could possibly do.
Okay.
I'm going to just like travel the world and not work or something.
So you wanted to be a bum, a dropout. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I probably wanted to be
did that
like
for a while, didn't you?
Yeah, I wouldn't have, I thought it felt I'd end up living in like Goa or Thailand or something like that.
Do you remember talking about the excitement of the kibbutz thing? Do you remember that?
Well, yeah, I do, though I never. Yeah, but
that seemed to have been
I remember
or something in those days.
Maybe
to go to a kibbutz in Israel.
I remember thinking I could never imagine just having a job and going into the office. I wouldn't be worth it. And I remember somebody saying to me, "But what are you going?" I was thinking, no, well, I can't see myself living past the age of 22 or 3 anyway. Like, it just seemed unlikely. So I just wanted to hang out with people and, have a few drinks and whatever.
Yeah.
And so anyway, reality eventually struck.
Yes.
I dropped out of college a couple of times.
Yeah.
And I had to go back to finish a degree eventually when I was probably 24 or 5.
What did you do a degree in?
I did it in science, in maths and computer science. And
what the hell are you doing in this job?
Well, so this is what I started off doing English and I dropped out, and then I came back a couple of years later and said, "Oh no, it's the English is the problem."
Maths and computer science sounds like a useful thing to have.
Yeah, it is useful if you're in any way good at it. So I scraped through that, and then I got a job as a computer programmer.
Yeah,
and I remember. Have you ever fallen asleep in work?
Yeah. Well,
at your actual desk?
No.
So
no, I don't think so.
I have absolutely fallen asleep at work.
I can imagine in that job. Though.
Yeah, but actually falling asleep. So I was so unsuited to it.
So bored.
Well, so unsuited to it. So bad at it.
I used to fall asleep actually in school all the time.
Yes.
All the
exactly.
time. To the extent that they were worried
and
about
have you ever
diet and everything.
You've been a journalist straight away. So, but you've ever done a job that you've been so incompetent at and knowing you're incompetent?
Most of the other things I do in life, if you call them a job or not, I'm totally incompetent.
So I had that feeling all the time, and I had this. So anyway, I plodded along and eventually got told we're having to make cutbacks. You're going to be let go.
Yeah.
And I was living in a house in Ranelagh with a friend of mine who was working for the Sunday Times.
Okay.
And I had to pay my rent, and he said, "Oh, they need somebody to write about a spread on property."
Mm-hmm.
And so I wrote, the first story I ever wrote was about the property market in Holt.
Right.
And I was probably 26 or 27. I mean, I'd never even considered buying a house, let alone being aware. Like, that was all the Celtic Tiger time. That was it all zipped me by.
You missed all that,
I missed all of that. And I wrote an article in Holt. And then eventually I went back and got a job.
And when you say you went back and did you go back and have to study?
Yeah, I went back and did
for what, a year?
For a year, yeah.
Yeah.
And did
journalism. See, I always say to people that really there's so many different ways into journalism. Like, you don't need a degree. You don't need to be good at English. You don't need to be able to bloody well spell nowadays.
No. I tell you what you need, like cop on and a bit of
street smarts, a little bit of cop on, and being able to communicate, which is something that's really lacking in the office environment, I think, nowadays. That, like, we were only talking because how did we get talking with Thomas Turner? I'll give him his full name. Yeah. I told Thomas today that he's made it in life because I refer to him as Thomas.
Lawyer. Yeah. He's
Thomas Turner. And we were talking about it, and he's a lot younger, certainly, than me and you.
No,
really,
but
you're not that much younger than me either. But anyway, no, it was the idea of, I remember going into the press at 15 or 16 or whatever it was, and it was this. It was, what did you describe it as? Like, it was like a building site.
Yeah, it was like a building site.
It was unbelievable. Like, it was terrifying. And there was just people everywhere. Everybody was smoking. Quite a lot of people were drunk in the middle of the day. And it was exciting. Like, it was except you weren't part of it. You were too young. And I was just like, oh my God. And I remember sitting down at the news desk at the time. I'm sure those news editors were so busy back then that they just didn't want a bloody student in, but everyone's smoking. I was like this, my eyes watering. And this phone rang beside me and I went, oh, Jesus Christ.
What am I going to do?
I was panicking inside, completely panicking. And then I sort of thought, if I look this way and pretend I'm interested in something over there, nobody will notice. And of course, the phone kept ringing. And then Mick Sharkey, who's a lovely guy from Derry, who was a news editor, got up and let a roar at me. Will you answer that fucking phone? So I sort of, hello, answered the phone, terrorised. But nonetheless, there was something about it the atmosphere of it. And
Well,
I got brought down to the courts by a guy called Paul Muldowney, who was the courts reporter, the crime sort of reporter at the time. And from memory, we were down at the sentencing of Eamon Kelly
right.
for
Cocaine. Yeah, the first ever major cocaine shipment into Ireland.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And I remember going into the courts. It was in the old courts, the High Court. And it was in one of those, it was in the one, as you go in the front door on the right, there was 4 courts in that round
the little
room,
circle room, yeah.
And it was in one of those, and we sort of careered in and took our seats. I hadn't a clue what was happening. And then it turned out that this was this big, huge story. And he was really good to take me.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a busy day for him. And
well, I got my first sort of regular job. I was probably nearly 30 by the time, and it was in the Sunday Mirror. And I remember going in, we got work experience from the college course. And there's loads of people actually on that college, like people like Niamh Horan was on that master's course, but they were all like 10 years maybe, or slightly less than 10 years younger than me.
Right.
So they all got snapped up by like RTE and the Sunday Times and the Sunday Indo. And I was the last person to get a placement. Because I was
it's like an orphanage.
So, and then I got a placement in the Sunday Mirror, the final place. And now, when I say I had never read a tabloid newspaper in my life, I had never read. I mean, you know, I remember they were doing a story. I think it was, I can't remember what criminal it was, but it could have been somebody like John Gilligan.
Yeah.
No, I must have known who John Gilligan was, so it wasn't John Gilligan. But just say somebody a slightly lesser pedigree, and going, I've never heard of him. Idea. And then that's one side of it. But Sunday Mirror was more celebrities, and I did not know any of them. Now, if you'd asked me about the conflict in Serbia and Kosovo or whatever, I would have known it. I'd never read it, but and I really, really struggled.
Yeah,
but I was 30, and then by another 5 or 6 years, I got a good job in the Sunday World.
Yeah. That's gas, isn't it? Like when you think about that now, yeah. And like, you know, to go back to the person asking this question, saying they ended up in insurance, like lots of people come into, not lots, but you can come into journalism later in life.
Yeah.
I mean, we're working with somebody in recent years who came in through an internship who was far older than, you know, the usual early 20s people. People come in,
you know, like
having done a degree. People come in on internships. People come in and learn on the ground, and actually that's the best way
and like
of learning.
It's, like some people, it's an instinct that people have. Is it what is a story? I mean, that's the most basic form.
That's for basic journalism, but the job has changed and progressed as well to such an extent that there's loads of different options.
There's loads of different
options. You don't have to be the person out on the road. Some people love that.
Yeah.
I remember getting a job as a news editor on the Daily Mirror when I was 26 years of age. It was a really big deal at the time. I was very young. I think I was the youngest news editor in the country.
Yeah.
And it was a very well-paid job, etc. I lasted a year.
Yeah.
I hated it because I would have to sit there every morning, do up a news list and send someone else on the jobs that I wanted to be on.
Yeah.
I quit.
Yeah.
You know, it was almost unheard of that you'd do that. But
see, you've got a great, your great gift is, I suppose, seeing where you want to go in terms of journalism.
How do you mean?
But say, even on this podcast, like you perceived the end point before it even started. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, but I don't know.
That is your thing. As in, this is what I want to be doing, and then finding a route to get there. But I mean, my life has been a thing of I'm falling into this. I'll try and do this as the best I can. But journalism is the thing about it is it's a tougher job than it was in terms of, you know, it's much more insecure
but it's an incredibly enjoyable job.
It's incredible. I mean, you are never ever bored.
Ever bored. It's one of those sort of things that you kind of go, am I actually getting paid to do this? I'm enjoying it this much. And other people seem to be fascinated by what you do and all the rest of it. There's many ways into it. And, you know, while people have to understand that, you know, you have to kind of work hard to get up the ladder a little bit, it can be very, very satisfying. And
Yeah,
you
never
certainly meet all sorts of people that you wouldn't in regular life, or probably while working in insurance, although I'm sure you can meet all sorts anywhere really. But yeah, and you have great experiences. And I mean, the one thing I sort of always stuck to was, maybe because I got that thing so early in life when I got that news editor role, that administrative thing, as you know me well.
Yeah.
It's just not my skill set.
No. You're better off being in charge of yourself, Nicola.
And that's about
That
all I can.
Even then, you're a burden to yourself some of the time, I'd say. Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.